Hey groupers, Pastor Marshall here. I hope that you are ready to dig in to the fourth chapter of the book of Acts. First, to break the ice. Married folks, I told a story about Claudia and I's first big fight. Maybe you would take a moment and talk about your first real big fight. Now, if you're single, well, maybe you would share some big struggle that followed something that was really good. It might be work, it might be a friendship, but just share a persecution story. And then, second icebreaker. If you've ever been part of a new church, talk about what was the first time that big trouble came. If you've ever been part of a church start, when did big trouble come? Tell that story. Well, the first thing that we need to do is we need to remember the story that we're in. We need to remember the context. Our story has been bleeding on now for a second chapter. It's a long story. Peter and John healed the lame man in chapter 3 as he was begging at the beautiful gate at the temple. And then Peter preached a message to those that had watched the healing at the temple. And now, after preaching the message, he has been apprehended. Peter and John are placed in prison. They're locked up. So that's the story that we're in. So let's label the key characters of this story, just so that we know what's going on. Who is the temple guard? What role does he play? Second, who are the Sadducees? And name one significant thing about the Sadducees that makes them at conflict specifically with Peter and John. And then, who is Annas? And who is Caiaphas? Who is John, most likely? And who is Alexander? Just remember those folks, label them. Then, take a moment and try to describe the political and the religious environment that is fueling this conflict. Why is this such a hot button? What is going on in this story that has them so divided? Next, I want you to compare Peter's messages. Peter has preached 3 messages now, and I want you to compare Acts chapter 4, verses 8 through 12, what he says to these religious leaders, with his message in Acts chapter 2, his first sermon on the day of Pentecost, and with his message in Acts chapter 3 to those that had watched him heal the lame man. This is what I want you to do. I want you to try to name 3 things in each message that are identical. And then, is there any conflict? Are there any disagreements between what Peter has said on these 3 different occasions? Is he making conflicts in his own world? Peter quotes Psalm 118. That's the next thing for us to look at, which Jesus used to describe himself in the Gospels. The funny thing is that the very last word in this verse can be translated to mean 2 different things. It can be translated as either cornerstone or it can be translated as capstone. So take a moment and just talk about, what does a cornerstone do? What is the role of a cornerstone? And then, what does a capstone do? What is the place of a capstone? They're different. And how could either be an accurate picture of what Jesus has done for us? How could either way that we translate Psalm 118 be a good translation? And then finally, which would you prefer? The NIV uses capstone in the 1984 edition. What does your Bible use? And which is your favorite, capstone or cornerstone, for describing Jesus? Well, the last thing that I'd like you to discuss is government submission and divine submission. Peter and John say that they must obey God first, even if it means that they're going to be breaking this new law that their government, their religious government, has put in place. Are there laws right now in the United States that you believe that a Christian is morally obligated to break? Then, what sort of laws might be created that you believe that you would be unwilling to submit to as a follower of Jesus Christ? Where do you draw the line between government submission and divine submission? And has there been any conflicts presently in your life in those regards? Well, every week I want you to talk about what you like, and I want you to talk about what you don't like. What I like, well, I just like how Peter and John are clearly called country boys in this passage. and yet they have schooled the scholars. I like that. What do I not like? Well, besides the obvious, I don't like that it says at the very end there were further threats. This quickly illustrates the weakness that these Jewish leaders are in. You see, in my experience, you threaten someone who you know you are weaker than. And so you try to make yourself bigger by threatening them. Threats come from a position of weakness. Clearly, these religious leaders are seeing that they're on the losing side, and yet they're still threatening. Well, finally, I want to remind you of the application that we make every week. And so this week's application was that we would have confidence with the message of Jesus, that we would be excited to tell it. So many times I think that we fear telling people about what Jesus has done. But in this story, Peter and John show us confidence. Well, I hope that you have a great group, and I look forward to seeing you this next weekend at church. God bless.